The earth remembers in ways that flesh cannot. Beneath the oceans, beneath the slow layers of silt and salt, there may sleep the remnants of worlds erased. What if our history is only the shadow of a longer tale, interrupted by waters that swallowed all names, all monuments, all songs? What if the stories told in whispers, the great flood, the deluge of gods and kings, were not myths, but memories of something far more devastating? In many cultures, from Mesopotamia to the Andes, from the Indian subcontinent to the ice-rimmed north, echoes of a flood resurface, insistent, like a dream repeating itself across centuries. The Epic of Gilgamesh speaks of walls of water, the Bible of an ark and a covenant, the Popol Vuh of a sky that collapsed in rain. And scientists, sifting through strata of sediment, ice cores, and shattered coastlines, have asked if these voices belong to a single storm that ended something greater than we recall. Could there have been civilisations, advanced yet forgotten, standing proud before ours, obliterated in a single drowning breath of the planet? Could the ocean's silence be not emptiness but concealment? Let the mind wander where history grows faint, where myth and geology touch hands in twilight. Here begins a descent, a meditation on ruins unseen and questions unanswered. Welcome to ARCHAEON. If you're drawn to stories like these, the ones that live in the shadows between what we see and what was made to disappear, feel free to like and subscribe only if it feels right, and let me know in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now. I love seeing our little map of watchers light up around the world. The night does not reveal everything at once. It withholds, as though testing the patience of those who lean into silence. When the waters are mentioned, when one whispers of a deluge that might have torn open the fabric of history, the instinct is to dismiss it as a parable, a lesson stitched into the moral cloth of religion. Yet beneath that surface, somewhere between the mineral record and the myth, a dissonance hums. Around 12,000 years ago, as the last ice age drew its weary breath, something shifted with terrifying speed. Glaciers melted in torrents, seas surged across coastlines, and animals that had thrived for millennia vanished almost overnight. To some, this is the slow poetry of climate change. To others, it is evidence of a catastrophe sudden enough to erase whole chapters of human story. One cannot gaze at Göbekli Tepe, that ancient sanctuary in southeastern Turkey, without wondering how it fits into this riddle. Carved pillars more than 11,000 years old rise like frozen prayers, etched with animals, celestial signs, and forms we still struggle to decode. How could hunter-gatherers, supposedly without agriculture or settled towns, create such a vision? And why did they bury it deliberately beneath earth, as if shielding knowledge from the gaze of a future not yet prepared? Some archaeologists argue it was the world's first temple, others that it was a cosmic map, a reflection of skies and cycles long forgotten. Still others whisper that it may have been the last refuge of survivors from an earlier civilization, driven by the rising waters to preserve fragments of what they once knew. The flood myths converge with uncanny precision. In Mesopotamia, Utnapishtim is warned of an approaching storm and builds a vessel to save life. In India's ancient Shatapatha Brahmana, Manu is guided by a fish, an avatar of Vishnu, to construct an ark before the waters engulf the land. In Greece, Deucalion and Pyrrha survive a deluge sent by Zeus, and from them humankind is reborn. What compels cultures separated by oceans to tell the same tale, unless all were remembering something they had endured? Modern geology records the sea's merciless hunger, swallowing Doggerland, the stretch of land that once joined Britain to continental Europe, and submerging entire coastlines from the Black Sea to the Sunda Shelf of Southeast Asia. The waters rose not in centuries, but in pulses, sudden and devastating, like breaths of a world convulsing. To the skeptical eye, myth is coincidence, a human tendency to fear water and shape it into cautionary lore. Yet there are anomalies too heavy to ignore. Off the coast of Yonaguni in Japan, beneath meters of salt and shadow, lie structures that resemble stairways, terraces, and monolithic platforms. Some insist they are merely natural formations, sculpted by the restless sea. Others, standing on those silent ledges, feel the weight of design. In India's Gulf of Kambat, sonar scans have revealed geometric patterns, grids and walls, stretching across the seabed. Artifacts pulled from the currents suggest antiquity, older than any city we have mapped. Are these mirages of interpretation, or remnants of settlements drowned when the oceans claimed their dominion? Conflict arises with every step deeper. Conventional history insists civilization began around 6,000 years ago, with Sumer, with Egypt, with the birth of writing. Before that, there were nomads, small bands of gatherers, nothing capable of cities or temples. To suggest otherwise is to challenge a foundation upon which entire academic disciplines rest. And yet, the stones wait, the carvings stand, the myths align like constellations across the human mind. One can almost hear the murmuring. What if the story of progress we inherit is not the first, but the second telling? What if humanity has been reset, its memory drowned, its echoes scattered in song and ruin? The Younger Dryas impact. Hypothesis proposes that a comet or fragments of it struck Earth around 10,800 BCE, igniting wildfires, disrupting climates, and accelerating floods. Though controversial, it lingers like a ghost in scientific debate, unable to be buried. Nanodiamonds, high-temperature spherules, and traces of platinum in sediment layers have been pointed to as scars of such a strike. If true, this would mean that a global disaster, fire followed by water, descended upon a fragile world, leaving survivors clinging to scraps of knowledge. Could they have been the ancestors who told of gods descending, of stars guiding, of floods that wiped the slate clean? Could the gods themselves have been only those who remembered, bearing fragments of a lost science mistaken for divinity? The stories of Atlantis, spoken first by Plato, shimmer at the edges of this possibility. He described an island nation, powerful and radiant, sinking beneath the waves in a single day and night of misfortune. Scholars dismiss it as allegory, a moral tale about hubris and justice. Yet why did Plato insist it was true, sourced from Egyptian priests who preserved memory older than Greek history itself? Could Atlantis have been one of many lost lands, swept into the silence of the sea? Some link it to the Azores, others to the Caribbean, others to the Mediterranean itself. Perhaps the name is less important than the pattern it preserves. The remembrance of a world undone by the flood. Every culture, every ruin, every drowned shore adds another thread. Together they weave something too intricate to dismiss outright. The skeptics remind us that extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. And yet, what evidence survives a flood? Wood rots, flesh dissolves, Cities crumble when swallowed by salt and tide. Only stone resists, and even then, not forever. What is left may be fragments, too broken to convince, too incomplete to rewrite history. Still, the fragments speak, quietly but insistently. There is an unease in recognizing that we may not be the first to rise, that our skyscrapers, satellites, and archives may be only temporary gestures in a cycle vaster than memory. If waters have swept away worlds before, could they do so again? If civilizations once reached heights unimagined and fell into silence, what does that say about the fragility of ours? Perhaps the flood is not only a tale of the past, but a mirror for the future, reminding us that permanence is an illusion, that oceans move with a patience beyond our comprehension. And so the mind lingers on an image, a shoreline now far beneath the waves, streets of stone patrolled only by fish, walls engraved with symbols no longer read. Who walked there? Who carved their stories into the pillars of Göbekli Tepe, or charted stars now lost to us? Did they watch the waters rise, helpless, carrying their libraries, their memories, their children into the abyss? Were they like us, believing themselves secure, unaware that history would reduce them to whispers in myth? The flood does not answer. It holds its secrets beneath layers of pressure and silence, leaving us with only speculation and the tremor of recognition. Perhaps in dreaming of lost worlds, we are only listening to something buried deep within ourselves, a memory not of personal experience but of the species, a haunting passed from ancestor to descendant, warning us that the earth forgets no wound. The night deepens, and so does the question. If the great flood erased what came before, what fragments still lie waiting, unrecognized beneath our feet? What truths might we glimpse if the waters ever yield them back? Or perhaps they will never return, and we are destined only to wander in the shadow of what was, guided by stories, myths, and ruins that speak without words. Shadows thicken when one dares to look backward beyond the threshold of recorded time. The idea that a single cataclysm could sweep away not only landscapes, but memories unsettles the very notion of continuity. To trace it, one must wander among the ruins not yet fully explained, where the stones seem to murmur of hands that knew far more than they should have, hands guided perhaps by traditions inherited from ancestors, swallowed by the sea. Consider the monumental mystery of the Sphinx at Giza, its leonine body scarred by deep channels of water erosion. Geologists such as Robert Schoch have suggested that these patterns could not have been carved by mere wind and sand, but by heavy rainfall thousands of years before dynastic Egypt ever raised its first pharaoh. If the Sphinx indeed predates the civilization we credit with building it, then who chiseled its form? Whose eyes gazed upon it before the desert became desert, when the land was green and storms poured across the plateau? The suggestion unsettles historians, for to accept it would unravel timelines carefully built over generations. Yet the evidence persists, written not in ink, but in the weathering of limestone, in the way its surface crumbles in rhythms that resemble ancient rainfall more than desert winds. If so, the Sphinx becomes a sentinel of memory, a relic standing on the shore of the flood that swept away its makers. And if that flood was no myth, but part of the global surges that ended the Ice Age, then Egypt's oldest guardian may have belonged not to Egypt at all, but to a civilization erased. Similar enigmas surface in South America, where the high plateau of Bolivia holds the ruins of Tiwanaku and its enigmatic neighbor, Puma Punku. Here lie stones of such scale and precision that modern tools struggle to replicate them. Blocks of andesite and sandstone weighing hundreds of tons rest in arrangements suggesting advanced quarrying and transport. Cuts in the rock appear unnervingly sharp, grooves aligned as if shaped by machines unknown to history. Archaeologists argue for gradual construction over centuries by indigenous cultures. Yet the sheer weight, the geometry, the seeming impossibility of moving such masses at altitudes exceeding 12,000 feet press the imagination into darker corners. Could these structures have been erected with knowledge carried from another age, preserved by survivors who endured the rising waters and began again among the peaks? There are traditions in the Andes that speak of Viracocha, a bearded god who came from across the waters after a great destruction. He is said to have walked among the people, teaching them arts of civilization before departing over the Pacific. Was Viracocha a myth, or the memory of travelers who bore fragments of lost knowledge from lands that no longer exist? His name surfaces in echoes of similar figures. Oannes in Mesopotamia, who rose from the sea to teach writing and law. Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica, the feathered serpent who brought agriculture and astronomy. Osiris in Egypt, a divine king who ruled after a deluge. Across continents, across oceans, these figures carry the same motif. Teachers who emerged after disaster, bringers of wisdom in a broken world. What if they were not gods, but the last guardians of an earlier epoch? The conflict with orthodox scholarship intensifies here. Mainstream archaeology sees in these myths the natural human urge to explain progress through divine intervention. To suggest that such figures represent historical survivors of advanced civilizations is branded pseudoscience, an affront to carefully built chronologies. Yet the myths persist, not in one culture, not in two, but everywhere, as if humanity itself could not forget. Like dreams remembered across generations, they weave a story too consistent to be dismissed entirely. What is myth, after all, if not the survival of memory when history is drowned? Geological evidence adds another layer. Around the time the Younger Dryas period ended, sea levels rose by more than 100 meters, swallowing continental shelves and coastal plains that had once stretched for miles. Places where millions might have lived are now hidden beneath waves. The continental shelves of Southeast Asia, known as Sundaland, once held fertile valleys, rivers, and perhaps cities before they were submerged. Similar stories surround the Caribbean basin, where sudden floods may have reshaped islands and coasts, giving rise to legends of Atlantis. If humanity had built settlements there, they are now lost to the depths, unexcavated, unseen, preserved only in story. Evidence of ancient maps hints at memory older than history admits. The Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral, contains coastlines uncannily resembling Antarctica without its ice cover. Scholars debate its accuracy, some calling it coincidence, others suggesting it was compiled from far older sources. If such cartographic knowledge survived into the Renaissance, then who charted those shores long before European ships dared the Atlantic? Was it possible that seafarers from an earlier age mapped lands we thought unknown, carrying knowledge passed like a relic across time? Each anomaly calls into question the neat progression of civilization from simple to complex, from primitive to advanced. The conventional model assumes linear ascent, from caves to villages, from villages to cities, from cities to empires. But the earth may not operate in straight lines. It may erase, then allow rebirth, then erase again. What we call beginnings may only be fragments of recoveries. Our story may be less a ladder and more a spiral, climbing yet circling back over ruins of what came before. If floods erased civilizations, then the silence of oceans is not a void, but a veil. Beneath the Atlantic, beneath the Indian Ocean, beneath the Mediterranean itself, lie landscapes we have not yet mapped. Sonar reveals hints of formations, geometric outlines blurred by silt. Divers return with reports of walls, pillars, streets lying in uncanny symmetry. Science demands caution, and rightly so, for the sea is master of illusions. Yet one cannot help but wonder, if even one of these reports is true, then all of history tilts. Climax gathers like thunder when one contemplates the possibility that humanity is a species with amnesia, as author Graham Hancock once described. That phrase lingers with unsettling resonance. Amnesia means not that nothing existed, but that memory has been shattered. A child waking from trauma may not recall the fire, though the scar remains. Could our species bear scars of forgotten fire and flood, even as our myths whisper of what our minds cannot fully hold? And so the question lingers at the close of this passage. If water has always been both cradle and grave of civilization, then what else lies hidden beneath its patient surface? The Sphinx stares across desert horizons, Puma Punku holds its silent blocks, and myths of gods' teachers echo through the corridors of time. Do they point to fragments of a greater whole, or are they coincidences woven by the hungry imagination of humankind? The sea keeps its counsel, indifferent, eternal. The tide continues to rise and fall, indifferent to memory or myth. And in that indifference, the heart of the mystery deepens. What is left to be uncovered may not be stone or artifact, but a question that will not sleep. If the Great Flood did not merely wash the earth, but the mind of humanity itself, then what are we, if not wanderers in the ruins of a story half remembered, half erased, still unfolding beneath the waves? There are silences in history more eloquent than words, absences that press themselves against the imagination until one begins to sense the contours of what is missing. The Great Flood, if it indeed scoured the earth of earlier civilizations, would have left behind not merely ruins, but the faintest of impressions, anomalies, fragments, echoes. These fragments, geological scars, submerged ruins, inexplicable artifacts, do not declare themselves openly. They whisper, requiring the listener to pause, to lean closer, to risk believing that the past is larger than what the textbooks allow. Consider the Black Sea, that inland sea whose waters now churn with a deceptive calm. Around 7,000 years ago, evidence suggests it was not a sea at all, but a vast freshwater lake, ringed with fertile plains. Then, as the Mediterranean surged, saltwater cascaded through the Bosporus with catastrophic force, flooding villages and sweeping away entire cultures that had thrived along its shore. Archaeologists excavating near its depths have found traces of human settlement now drowned in silt. Could this cataclysm, sudden and world-defining for those who endured it, be the echo of the biblical flood, for the people who watched their homes vanish under waves, who fled inland carrying only fragments of memory? What was lost was not simply land, but the heart of a world. And yet the Black Sea is but one stage of a larger theater. The Persian Gulf, too, was once a fertile plain where rivers converged in lush valleys before rising seas drowned them. Some scholars have suggested this region may be the source of Mesopotamian flood myths, a memory refracted through centuries into tales of gods and judgment. The Gulf of Mexico bears scars of sudden impacts and mega-flooding, while the North American continent still holds evidence of massive outburst floods unleashed when glacial lakes burst their icy dams at the close of the Ice Age. The sheer scale of these events, walls of water rushing at unimaginable speeds, carving landscapes, leaving behind dry coulees and erratic boulders, renders myth almost unnecessary. Yet myth emerges, as if humans must make sense of terror through story. The question grows sharper when we turn to artifacts that defy context. In deposits dated to tens of thousands of years, there appear occasional out-of-place objects, metal spheres, geometrically perfect, fragments of worked stone found where no hands should have existed. These discoveries are often dismissed as misinterpretations, mistakes of stratigraphy, or natural oddities. But they persist, a catalogue of puzzles. If one accepts even the possibility that an earlier epoch achieved heights of skill, then such artifacts may be nothing more than splinters of a shattered whole, evidence eroded but not erased. Conflict, inevitably, arises when the guardians of accepted chronology confront such speculation. To suggest that civilizations existed before Sumer, before Egypt, is to risk ridicule. It unsettles the linear ascent upon which modern history depends. Yet the erosion on the Sphinx, the megaliths at Baalbek, the submerged cities hinted at in India's coastal waters, all these suggest discontinuity rather than smooth progression. Why should humanity be so fragile as to collapse utterly, leaving only faint traces? And yet why should it not, when even in our own time we can imagine how swiftly cities could vanish if the seas rose again, if archives burned, if satellites fell silent? The climax of unease arrives when one considers not only the physical traces, but the patterns in human myth and memory. Across continents, stories speak of golden ages undone by water, of gods who once dwelled among mortals, of a wisdom lost in punishment or accident. The Greeks spoke not only of the flood of Deucalion, but of earlier ages, each destroyed in turn, the age of gold, the age of silver, the age of bronze. The Hopi tell of previous worlds destroyed by fire and by flood, of migrations guided by spirit beings. Hindu cosmology preserves yugas, vast cycles of rise and fall, where human memory stretches far beyond the horizon of what we call history. Such accounts might be allegory, or they might be the last remnants of collective memory, encoded in myth to outlast the frailty of stone. The implications unsettle. If there were civilizations before ours, where are their tools, their machines, their libraries? And yet, what would survive 12,000 years of erosion, tectonics, and submersion? Modern cities, if abandoned, would crumble in centuries. Within millennia, concrete would dissolve, steel would rust into silence, only a few stone monuments might endure. If our world were to drown today, what would be left for future beings to uncover? Perhaps a few pyramids, perhaps carvings in granite, but little else. Why, then, should we expect more of those who came before? The oceans hold their silence firmly. Sonar images show formations along the Cuban coast, underwater structures with right angles and stepped terraces. Divers speak of roads submerged off Bimini, the so-called Bimini Road, a formation of stone blocks that some claim to be remnants of a harbor or wall. Mainstream geology insists these are natural, the product of fractured limestone. Yet the human mind strains against such neat dismissal, sensing intent in geometry, longing for connection in the cold precision of angles beneath the waves. The sea could hide entire histories, and we would not know. It is here that the story folds back into philosophy. What if the Great Flood was not a singular event, but a cycle, a rhythm written into the planet's breath? Ice builds, then melts, seas retreat, then surge. Civilizations rise in the margins, flourish in interludes, and fall again when waters reclaim the land. Humanity's amnesia may be less an accident than a design, a pattern that erases pride before it can calcify into permanence. Could it be that each epoch is both first and last, both beginning and end? The silence of drowned continents presses this question further. Sunderland, now beneath the Java Sea, once stretched as a vast expanse of fertile land, binding islands into one. Aboriginal traditions in Australia remember rising waters chasing their ancestors inland, stories verified by geological data of sea level rise. Such oral histories, carried for thousands of years, become more than myth. They are living memory of a flood that reshaped continents. What else might be hidden in the songs of the past, misread as legend, but grounded in the bone of the earth itself? No closure comes, only deeper mystery. Perhaps this is the true gift of the flood myths, not certainty, but humility. They remind us that the ground beneath our feet is not eternal, that history is fragile, that memory can drown. They ask us to consider what we cannot see, what we cannot prove, yet what we cannot entirely dismiss. The sea, in its endless breathing, becomes not only water but an archive, a keeper of lost chapters, waiting, perhaps forever, to be read. And so the night lingers on a question, quiet but insistent. If the Great Flood erased advanced civilizations before ours, then what of us? Do we walk unaware on the same edge, repeating cycles too vast for the mind to contain? Are we not also subject to the tides, to the patient silence of oceans that remember what we forget? In the spaces between waves, in the deep stillness of drowned plains, perhaps the answer waits, not to be revealed, but to be felt as a tremor of recognition. Darkness deepens when the gaze shifts from the stones we can touch to the skies that record what we cannot. If water erased the memory of civilizations, perhaps the heavens, indifferent to floods, have kept a record in patterns of light. Ancient monuments, scattered across continents, seem to reach toward the stars, aligning with celestial events in ways too deliberate to ignore. What does it mean that so many of the oldest structures, pyramids in Egypt and Mexico, stone circles in Britain, the megaliths of Nabta Playa, are bound not only to the earth but to the cosmos? Were these the works of shepherds and farmers seeking guidance, or were they echoes of a knowledge carried forward from an age before the flood, an age now hidden beneath the sea? At Nabta Playa, deep in the Nubian desert, stones arranged in circles mark solstices and equinoxes with uncanny precision, dating back more than 7,000 years. This site predates the Great Pyramids, yet it demonstrates an awareness of astronomical cycles that would not become central to Egyptian religion for millennia. At Göbekli Tepe, carvings of animals and symbols on T-shaped pillars have been interpreted as celestial maps, markers of constellations seen in the skies of 12,000 years ago. If such alignments are intentional, they suggest a continuity of knowledge through the turmoil of climate collapse. Survivors of a flood, staring at the heavens for constancy as the earth drowned beneath them, may have encoded their memory in stone to outlast the chaos. The pyramids of Giza themselves remain a nexus of this question. Their alignment with Orion's belt has long been a source of speculation. Mainstream archaeology views them as tombs, royal monuments erected through the labor of thousands. Yet their placement, their proportions, and their orientation toward cardinal points evoke something deeper. A cosmological scheme, a message written in geometry. If the pyramids mirror Orion, and the Nile mirrors the Milky Way, then the builders were inscribing heaven upon earth. Was this knowledge their own, or inherited from a lineage that reached back before the flood? And why does the erosion on the Sphinx suggest a wetter, older epoch, one that no pharaoh should have remembered? Turning westward across the ocean, one encounters Teotihuacan, the ancient city of pyramids near Mexico City. Its avenue of the dead is aligned to celestial rising points, its pyramids echoing both earthly volcanoes and stellar configurations. The Pyramid of the Sun, immense and commanding, rises as if to challenge time itself. And yet, Teotihuacan's origins remain mysterious. Who built it? Why was it abandoned? No inscriptions tell the story. Some scholars suggest it was a city of refugees, a convergence of traditions after catastrophe, its builders preserving in stone what the flood had nearly erased. The same pattern emerges in the Mayan cities, in the astronomical observatories of Chichen Itza and Uxmal, in the stelae that record cycles of time stretching back thousands of years. Always the stars, always the cycles, as if memory itself was hidden in the heavens. Conflict sharpens when skepticism intervenes. Historians insist such alignments may be coincidental, the natural result of long observation by agrarian societies dependent on seasons. And yet the scale, the precision, the repetition across cultures and continents raise the question, why does the same impulse appear everywhere? If this was merely the work of farmers, why such monumental devotion? Why stone carved in agony to record the heavens, unless the memory of destruction was tied to the sky itself? The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis lingers here, for if fragments of a comet struck the earth and unleashed floods, then the terror of fire falling from the sky would have been burned into memory. Survivors, in that case, would look upward not for beauty, but for warning. Alignments would become talismans, reminders, or prophecies. In this context, even myths take on new weight. The Greek tale of Phaethon speaks of a celestial body that scorched the earth before plunging into the river Eridanus. Native American traditions speak of fiery serpents streaking across the heavens, of burning fields and rivers boiling away. The Zoroastrian Avesta describes a star that fell and caused winter to seize the land. Were these merely allegories or recollections of a cosmic disaster that reshaped the earth and summoned the flood? If so, then the monuments are less about reverence and more about survival. Archives of the sky, preserved for future generations who might face the same fate. Climax gathers when one realizes that entire cycles of time in ancient cosmologies appear designed to mark catastrophic resets. The Mayan long count ends in Baktuns, vast spans of time culminating in destruction and renewal. Hindu cosmology describes kalpas and yugas, where the world is created, destroyed, and remade. Plato himself spoke of great year cycles, tied to astronomical shifts, where floods and fires cleanse humanity in rhythm with the cosmos. If myths, monuments, and alignments all speak to this pattern, then perhaps the Great Flood was not singular, but one chapter in a cosmic cycle that still continues. The earth breathes in ages, and with each exhalation civilizations vanish. Yet what does this mean for us? If ancient peoples encoded warnings in stone, we are poor readers of their language. We stand in museums and deserts, gazing at their works as curiosities, debating their purpose as though detached from consequence. But if these structures are messages, they may not be intended for scholars. They may be intended for survivors, for those who live after the next flood, the next reset. A chilling thought emerges. Perhaps we are not their audience at all, but only custodians until the cycle turns again. The lull returns with the recognition that the stars remain unchanged. They watched the waters rise and fall. They watched empires crumble. They watch us now as we light our cities into false constellations. If there were civilizations before ours, they too looked upward, tracing hope and terror in the same patterns. The monuments they left behind may not be triumphs of architecture, but prayers in stone, attempts to hold on to memory in a world that forgets too easily. And so the night closes with an image, a pyramid shadow stretching across sand at dawn, Orion still gleaming above the horizon, unchanged for millennia. The silence of stone and the silence of stars merge, and in their union lies a question we cannot still. Were these alignments born from human imagination alone, or from the last whispers of those who remembered the flood? The answer is withheld, like the stars themselves, distant and eternal. There is a kind of haunting in the ruins that lie far from rivers, deserts, or seas, places where time itself seems unsettled. When the question of forgotten civilizations arises, the gaze turns inevitably to the Andes, where the thin air of the high plateau holds secrets carved into stone. Here, among winds that cut like glass and skies that burn with a clarity rare on earth, stand monuments that strain belief, as though the mountain itself yielded to a vision too exact, too advanced for the age to which it is assigned. At Pumapunku, near Lake Titicaca, blocks of andesite rest like fallen giants. Some weigh hundreds of tons, yet they are cut with precision so sharp that thin sheets of metal could slide between them. Intricate notches and interlocking shapes suggest methods of engineering that modern tools would struggle to replicate at such scale and altitude. Archaeologists attribute these to the Tiwanaku culture, a people who flourished between the 5th and 12th centuries CE. Yet the ruins themselves seem older than the culture associated with them, fragments of something inherited rather than invented. Local traditions speak of Viracocha, a figure who rose after a deluge to teach civilization anew. Could Pumapunku have been his stage, a place where knowledge from an earlier epoch was anchored in stone before dispersing into myth? Lake Titicaca itself adds weight to this question. Beneath its surface, archaeologists have found submerged temples and roads, structures that hint at settlements drowned long before the Incas claimed the region. Was this lake always so vast? Or did rising waters swallow villages remembered now only in legend? In Andean cosmology, the lake is a place of origins, a womb from which gods and peoples emerged. Myths speak of floods that reshaped the land, of survivors guided by Viracocha to begin again. Perhaps these are not only sacred stories but memories, preserved in allegory, of real drownings, real displacements, real civilizations undone. The echo of precision stonework extends far beyond the Andes. In Egypt, the platform at Baalbek in Lebanon holds stones even larger than those at Puma Punku, blocks weighing more than 1,000 tons, fitted with unnerving accuracy. Who moved them, and how? Mainstream explanations suggest ramps, ropes, and human labor. Yet no clear demonstration has shown how such masses could be positioned with such elegance. To propose that these stones belonged to an earlier civilization, one capable of techniques now forgotten, is to court skepticism. And yet the question lingers. Why did later cultures build upon these foundations as if inheriting rather than originating them? Across the sea, in Easter Island, Moai statues stand as sentinels, their backs to the ocean, their gazes fixed inland. Carved from volcanic rock, their enormity overwhelms. Yet beneath the soil, excavations reveal full torsos, their bases rooted deep as if planted to withstand floods or upheavals. Oral traditions speak of ancestors who arrived after a cataclysm, bearing memory of lands drowned. The statues, massive and immovable, may have been anchors of continuity, attempts to preserve presence in a world where everything else could vanish. In their silence, they echo the same impulse as the pyramids, the megaliths, the drowned ruins, the urge to resist erasure. Conflict arises again when orthodoxy dismisses these patterns as overreach, insisting that cultures developed independently, achieving marvels through ingenuity, not inheritance. And yet, the same motifs repeat. Advanced stonework beyond explanation, myths of floods, gods who bring knowledge after catastrophe. To weave these threads together into a single fabric is dangerous, for it risks collapsing diversity into a singular tale. Yet to ignore their resonances is to blind oneself to the possibility of a deeper continuity, one written not in history books, but in stones and stories carried across oceans. Evidence of global disruption presses further when one considers the megafaunal extinctions at the end of the Ice Age. Mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, and saber-toothed cats disappeared in a geological instant. Some scientists attribute this to overhunting, others to climate change. But anomalies suggest catastrophe. Bones charred as if by sudden firestorms, deposits of black mats rich in soot and nanodiamonds. These are scars of trauma. If an impact or sudden solar event unleashed fire before flood, then the collapse of ecosystems may have dragged down human cultures alongside them. Survivors would rebuild, but with less, remembering only fragments, encoding trauma into myths of wrathful gods and cleansing waters. Climax gathers when one contemplates how such trauma might echo across millennia. The sudden vanishing of vast animals, the drowning of coasts, the collapse of food sources. Such events would not merely wound, they would shatter. And from shattering comes amnesia. Civilizations could rise to splendor, only to vanish without leaving libraries or cities intact. What remained would be stone, myths, and the dim pulse of memory. And perhaps, in the Andes, in the Mediterranean, in the Pacific, these remnants still wait, half seen, half understood. The question becomes not whether such civilizations existed, but whether their absence is itself part of a larger rhythm. If the Earth has reset humanity before, might it do so again? We speak of progress as though it were permanent, yet the floods remind us of impermanence. Even now, rising seas creep upon coastlines, ice melts at the poles, storms grow more violent. Are we walking unknowingly in the footsteps of those erased, repeating cycles too vast to escape? Lull settles like mist upon these reflections. The ruins stand silent under the stars, their edges softened by time, their meanings obscured. The myths echo in languages that no longer live, in chants half remembered by descendants who carry only fragments. And yet, in that silence, there is a kind of comfort. If civilizations have risen and fallen before, if floods have washed the slate clean again and again, then perhaps humanity is not singular, but part of a greater flow, a tide of memory and forgetting that binds us to the planet's breath. The night ends not with answers, but with an image. Viracocha walking along the Andean shore after the flood, teaching survivors to build again. Moai gazing across a drowned horizon, stone blocks lying like sleeping beasts beneath a sky too clear, too ancient. Were these the last gestures of worlds erased, or only the beginnings of ours? The question remains, suspended in the thin air of the high plateau, awaiting the patience of those willing to listen. There are places on this earth where silence feels heavier, where one cannot stand without sensing the press of ages. One such place lies beneath the waters of India's Gulf of Kambat, where sonar scans in the early years of this century revealed geometric forms, grids, walls, avenues stretching across the seabed. Divers recovered artifacts of stone and pottery, some dated to nearly 9,000 years ago, far older than the Indus Valley civilization traditionally considered the subcontinent's first great culture. The discovery was contested, debated, some dismissing it as misidentification, others warning against too much haste in rewriting history. Yet the images remain, the suggestion of a drowned city lying in the shadows of the sea. If true, it would predate not only Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, but Sumer itself. A city erased by rising seas, preserved only in fragments. This image of drowned cities hidden in depths resonates with Indian mythology. In the Mahabharata and the Puranas, there are tales of Dvaraka, the legendary city of Krishna, said to have been swallowed by the ocean. Excavations near modern Dwarka, on the western coast of India, have uncovered walls and foundations beneath the waves, lending unexpected weight to the story. Were these ruins the echoes of myth, or myth the memory of ruins? The line blurs until myth becomes archaeology, and archaeology myth. India's traditions preserve cycles of creation and destruction far larger than human lifespans. The yugas stretch into spans of millions of years, during which the world rises, decays, and is destroyed, often by flood or fire, before beginning anew. These cosmic scales seem unfathomable, yet beneath them lies an insight that civilization is fragile, impermanent, subject to forces beyond its control. Perhaps these stories did not arise from imagination alone, but from memory, fragments of eras lost when the seas rose and swallowed worlds. If the Gulf of Kambat holds such remnants, it would not be alone. Across Asia, whispers of drowned lands persist. Off the coast of Japan, the Yonaguni Monument lies beneath the waves, a stepped and terraced structure that some argue is natural rock formation, others insist is human-made. Its sharp angles and flat plains seem uncanny, as though the sea itself reluctantly reveals an earlier architecture. Off Cambodia, legends of ancient cities lost beneath Tonle Sap find faint resonance in sonar echoes. The pattern repeats. Where the water spreads, the ruins follow. Conflict deepens when one recalls that these potential sites are often dismissed by orthodoxy as accidents of geology, overzealous interpretation, or errors in dating. Yet to dismiss them outright may be to silence truths struggling to surface. Why should it be so inconceivable that humans, thousands of years before Sumer, built settlements, even cities, near coasts now drowned? After all, coasts have always been the cradle of habitation. Fertile lands, abundant waters, easy trade routes. If the seas rose over 100 meters as the Ice Age ended, then countless coastal cultures would have been submerged. Their ruins would not be anomalies, they would be inevitable. Climax sharpens when the scope of this loss is considered. Imagine the world at the end of the last glaciation. Vast plains stretching from Southeast Asia's Sundaland to the shallow gulfs of the Middle East, from Doggerland in northern Europe to the Caribbean basin. These were not marginal lands, but fertile heartlands, capable of sustaining millions. When the seas rose, when glaciers collapsed into torrents, these heartlands drowned. What remained on higher ground were only fragments of those peoples, dispersed, diminished, clinging to memory. Their myths would survive, but their monuments, their cities, their maps, these would vanish into saltwater silence. Even our own modern civilization, with satellites and archives, would fare poorly under such conditions. Imagine cities like New York, Shanghai, Mumbai, London submerged beneath the waves. In 10,000 years, little would remain except scattered stone, perhaps fragments of concrete, eroded into anonymity. Plastic might linger, twisted and unrecognizable. Libraries, databases, all would be dust. To future archaeologists, our own presence might appear as faint and enigmatic as the ruins at Yonaguni or Kambat do to us. If we can imagine our world erased so easily, why then should we doubt that others have already been forgotten? In the Indian traditions, floods are not only punishment, but transition. Manu, the primordial man, survives a deluge by building a boat guided by a fish. Matsya, the first avatar of Vishnu, after the waters recede, he begins humanity anew. This story parallels Noah, parallels Utnapishtim, parallels Deucalion. Always the flood, always the survivor, always the renewal. Could these be separate imaginations, or are they scattered memories of the same cataclysm, passed down through divergent tongues? If the flood truly erased civilizations, then these myths may be the only bridge between us and them, the fragile thread of memory unbroken even by oceans. The philosophy of impermanence hovers here like a shadow. Civilization, no matter how advanced, is temporary. Stones erode, seas rise, stars shift. To believe that ours will endure unbroken is to forget the lessons of the flood. Perhaps that is why myths persist, not to record history with precision, but to remind that history itself is vulnerable. The flood is not just water, it is the inevitability of forgetting, the tide that washes all certainties into silence. Lull settles with an image of the drowned city in Kambat, its streets empty, its walls softened by silt, its memory half preserved in the waves. Divers move among its shadows, lights flickering against stone. Above, the surface reflects stars, indifferent and eternal. Were these stones once part of a thriving world? Did children run through its streets? Did voices rise in song before the tide consumed them? The answer remains withheld, like the city itself, suspended between myth and science, between memory and oblivion. The sea does not answer, but its silence is eloquent. It holds what we have lost, and perhaps what we are yet to lose. And so the night closes, not with resolution, but with a question too vast for certainty. If the great flood has already erased civilizations before ours, how many more might lie hidden still, waiting, unheard, beneath the restless waves? There are landscapes that feel like scars, wounds upon the earth that whisper of violence beyond imagination. To follow the trail of the great flood and its echoes is to eventually arrive at the strange, unsettling record left behind in the soils and stones of North America. Here, across vast plains and broken valleys, lie the marks of floods so immense they defy scale. The channeled scablands of Washington State, with their deep coulees, erratic boulders, and dry waterfalls, speak of walls of water tearing across the land at speeds and volumes no river could explain. Once dismissed as the fantasies of J. Harlan Bretz, the geologist who first proposed them, these formations are now recognized as the aftermath of cataclysm, the bursting of glacial Lake Missoula at the end of the Ice Age, unleashing floods that would have drowned cities if cities had existed then. The violence of those floods is almost ungraspable. Imagine water thundering at hundreds of feet in height, tearing forests from their roots, grinding stone into dust, carrying boulders the size of houses as though they were pebbles. Imagine standing in their path, watching the world become liquid chaos, the ground itself stripped bare. Such sights would have burned themselves into memory. If people lived near those regions, they would not have forgotten. They would have told stories of water that devoured the land, stories their descendants would call myths. And perhaps those very stories became seeds of the flood legends carried into later cultures. But even these immense floods may not stand alone. Some researchers argue that the end of the Younger Dryas, the cold snap around 11,600 years ago, was marked by a global catastrophe. Proponents of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggest that fragments of a disintegrating comet struck the ice sheets of North America and Europe, igniting fires, darkening skies, and melting glaciers in a sudden surge. Evidence cited includes nanodiamonds, microspherules, and unusual concentrations of platinum in sediments of that age. Critics dispute these findings, yet the debate refuses to fade, as though the Earth itself resists silence. If such an impact occurred, it could explain not only the sudden extinction of megafauna like mammoths and mastodons, but also the rapid sea level rise that drowned coastlines across the globe. Conflict deepens when science hesitates at the threshold of myth. The Clovis culture of North America, once believed to be the earliest human presence on the continent, seems to vanish abruptly around the same period. Some suggest they were displaced, others that they adapted, still others that they were destroyed. Could a sudden catastrophe, fire from the sky, floods from melting ice, have erased them almost overnight? If so, their memory may linger only in fragments, petroglyphs of fiery shapes, oral traditions of fire serpents crossing the sky, tales of a world remade in water. Indigenous traditions across the Americas speak of floods, of great beasts destroyed, of the earth itself transformed. To dismiss these as coincidence is to ignore the possibility that memory survives not in monuments, but in voices, carried from generation to generation. The climax of this thought arrives when one considers that such cataclysms may have been global, not local. What if the floods that reshaped the Scablands, the Black Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the Indian coasts were all connected in time, fragments of a single upheaval? If a celestial event unleashed fire and water upon the planet, then the flood myths of Mesopotamia, of India, of Greece, of the Americas might not be separate stories, but one collective memory refracted across cultures. The Great Flood, then, is not parable but history, history written in fire, stone, and silence. And yet, what becomes of civilizations in such a storm? Could there have been societies, advanced yet fragile, erased by these disasters? If they lived near the coasts, if they built upon plains now drowned, their works would have vanished without trace. Only myths would endure, carried inland by survivors who watched their homes sink beneath waves. When they spoke of gods angry, of stars falling, of waters rising, they were not imagining, they were remembering. But memory, stripped of context, becomes myth, and myth becomes dismissed by those who seek only written words. The thought unsettles. What if humanity itself is older than we admit, older not by thousands, but by tens of thousands of years? Archaeological finds occasionally hint at this. Sites like Monteverde in Chile, dated at least 14,000 years old, challenge orthodox models of migration. Artifacts in Brazil and evidence of habitation in North America suggest even earlier presence. If people were here long before we thought, then who is to say what cultures rose and fell before the flood? Their tools may have been simple, or perhaps not. If floods and impacts destroyed them, then only fragments remain, fragments so faint we can barely recognize them. The scablands stand as testimony, vast dry canyons carved not by time, but by terror. Standing among them, one cannot help but feel small, as though the land itself remembers a violence too great to forget. To walk their lengths is to walk through a frozen scream, the echo of water that no longer flows. And in that silence, one hears the murmur of myth, the great flood, the wrath of gods, the world remade. The lull that follows is not comfort, but contemplation. If floods have reshaped continents before, they may do so again. Our cities, our coastlines, our archives, these too could vanish under water or fire. The myth of permanence is a fragile illusion. The flood reminds us that everything built is temporary, that memory itself can drown. And so the night closes with an image, the dry waterfalls of the scablands, cliffs carved by torrents that no longer flow. They stand like monuments to absence, reminders of waters that once roared and then vanished, leaving silence behind. Were these the floods that seeded the myths, the cataclysms that erased what came before? The answer remains submerged, waiting in the silence of the land itself, like a breath held too long, waiting to be released. Some mysteries hide not in open landscapes, but in the shadows beneath the sea, where maps falter and certainty dissolves into blue silence. One of the most haunting of these mysteries is Atlantis, the city Plato described in dialogues that have unsettled imaginations for more than 2,000 years. He claimed it lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles, a land rich with power, wealth, and knowledge that fell into the ocean in a single day and night of misfortune. Scholars often dismiss it as allegory, a moral tale about arrogance and decline. Yet the image persists, so vividly, so stubbornly, that it clings to the edge of possibility. What if Plato was not inventing but repeating a memory preserved by Egyptian priests? A fragment of a catastrophe already ancient when Greece was young? The echoes of Atlantis are not isolated. Ancient Mediterranean cultures carried tales of islands lost to the sea. In the Aegean, the eruption of Thera around 1600 BCE destroyed the Minoan civilization, unleashing tsunamis and clouds of ash. Archaeologists have linked this event to later flood myths, to legends of lands swallowed by ocean and sky. Yet Thera is too recent, too small to match Plato's account. Still, it reminds us that entire cultures can vanish into fire and water, leaving only whispers. What if there were other Theras, older, larger, erased before memory could harden into history? The Atlantic itself holds suggestions that stir unease. Off the coast of Cuba, sonar surveys in 2001 revealed vast formations of stone deep beneath the waves, aligned in geometric patterns that resembled streets and plazas. Some divers claimed to see monolithic structures, pyramids, walls. The discovery was controversial, the evidence debated, the images blurred. Yet the thought lingers. If Atlantis existed, if cities once stood upon coasts now drowned, would they not appear like this? Ghostly outlines glimpsed beneath the sea, too faint for certainty, too clear to ignore? Legends beyond Europe tell similar stories. In West Africa, traditions speak of cities claimed by the ocean. In Celtic lore, the tale of Cantre'r Gwaelod describes a kingdom in Wales lost to the sea when its floodgates failed. In Brittany, Caerys sank beneath waves, punished for excess and arrogance. Across the globe, the theme repeats: shining lands destroyed by water, hubris punished by drowning, memory reduced to song. Were these independent inventions, or scattered recollections of real cataclysms during the end of the Ice Age, when seas devoured coasts across every continent? Conflict intensifies when orthodoxy resists these connections. Scholars warn of conflating myth with history, of romanticizing lost golden ages. They argue that Plato's Atlantis was a story crafted to illustrate political ideals, not a record of geography. And yet why did he insist upon its truth? Why did he root it in the authority of Egyptian priests, guardians of memories that stretched back beyond Greece? To dismiss entirely is to silence a voice that may have carried knowledge through the centuries. Perhaps Atlantis was not a single city, not even a single culture, but a symbol of many drowned civilizations, collapsed into one name, one image, the city that fell into the sea. The climax of this mystery emerges when one considers that the Atlantic may not be the only ocean to hold such ruins. The Indian Ocean bears its own whispers, the legends of Kumari Kandam, a land south of India described in Tamil traditions, said to have been swallowed by rising seas. In Southeast Asia, the Sunda Shelf was once a vast expanse of land, drowned when ice melted. Aboriginal traditions in Australia preserve stories of coastal lands lost to the sea, stories now confirmed by geological evidence of rising waters thousands of years ago. Everywhere the ocean hides memory, everywhere myths echo the same refrain: we lived, we thrived, and the waters came. And yet perhaps the most haunting thought is not whether Atlantis or Kumari Kandam were real, but why the human mind clings to the image of a lost world. Why do cultures across time dream of a golden land undone by flood? Perhaps it is memory, yes, but perhaps it is also intuition, an awareness of the fragility of civilization. We build, we rise, but always the sea waits. Atlantis is not only the story of a city lost long ago, it is the story of what can be lost at any moment. It is a mirror, showing us the impermanence we refuse to see. The lull arrives when one imagines these drowned lands not as ruins but as silence. Fish swim through avenues once walked by human feet. Coral grows upon walls that once held frescoes. Sand buries inscriptions, erasing language. To look down into the ocean is to look into forgetting itself, into the vast archive of absence. The waves cover everything, smoothing jagged loss into surface calm. Atlantis, whether real or not, has become that surface, myth layered upon myth, memory layered upon memory, until the truth is unreachable. And so the night closes with an image, a city of light shimmering beneath the sea, unreachable yet persistent, a dream that refuses to dissolve. Whether it is Plato's invention, a memory of Thera, a whisper of Cuba's submerged stones, or the echo of countless drowned coasts, Atlantis endures because it speaks to something deeper than geography. It speaks to the fear that all civilizations, no matter how advanced, stand on the edge of forgetting. The waves are patient, and one day they will come again. There are moments when the weight of myth and science press so closely together that the boundary between them begins to blur. The Great Flood, with its many faces across cultures, may not have been a singular event, but rather a chorus of disasters stitched together by memory. One strand of this chorus leads us not to submerged ruins or star-aligned monuments, but to ice, endless, ancient, and merciless. For within the story of melting ice lies perhaps the most devastating clue to what was erased before us. At the close of the last ice age, vast ice sheets covered much of North America, Northern Europe, and Asia. These frozen giants held back oceans, locking water in mountain-high walls of white. When they collapsed, they did so not gently, but violently, releasing torrents that carved new landscapes in days. Meltwater pulses, as scientists call them, raised global sea levels by meters within centuries, sometimes within decades. Such surges would have swallowed coastal plains, river valleys, and estuaries where people lived. If early civilizations flourished there, their destruction would have been total, their memory carried only in myth. The most mysterious of these events is Meltwater Pulse 1b, occurring around 11,500 years ago, coinciding with the end of the Younger Dryas cold period. Sea levels rose suddenly, submerging vast stretches of land. To stand on the coast during such an event would have been to watch the horizon creep inward inexorably, to watch the ground disappear, villages vanish, and the sea claim everything familiar. Survivors fleeing inland would have carried their terror into story, telling children of gods angered, of oceans reborn, of a world washed clean. Geological records confirm that the seas did indeed rise abruptly, but they cannot tell us who was lost. The earth keeps scars, not names, yet oral traditions may provide what geology cannot. Aboriginal peoples of Australia, for instance, preserve stories of coastal lands swallowed by the sea, stories passed down for thousands of years and now validated by geological evidence. In South America, myths speak of great waters that once chased ancestors into the mountains. In North America, Algonquian traditions recall a world destroyed by flood, from which only a few were saved. In these tales, we glimpse memory preserved across generations, outlasting even stone. Conflict returns when we confront the skeptic's demand for evidence. Where are the cities, the tools, the signs of advanced cultures erased by these floods? But the question itself may be flawed. Civilization, as we define it, cities, writing, metallurgy, may not have been the form of what came before. Perhaps their advancement was not in steel or machines, but in knowledge, astronomy, navigation, oral tradition, a mastery of environment. If their settlements were of wood, mud, or simple stone, Little would survive the violence of rising seas. We search for skyscrapers in strata, where only memory could endure, then declare absence as proof. But absence is not proof. It is only silence. The climax of this reflection emerges when we consider that these floods did not merely erase lands. They may have shaped the very myths we live by. The Garden of Eden, described as a fertile place watered by 4 rivers, may echo a real memory of fertile lands drowned when the Persian Gulf flooded. The Sumerian tale of Ziusudra, the Babylonian story of Utnapishtim, the biblical flood of Noah, all may root in these same events, remembered differently. When myth after myth speaks of a righteous man warned, of an ark or a boat, of animals saved, it is hard not to hear the echoes of survivors who fled the waters, carrying fragments of life with them. What we call parable may be memory disguised, preserved because to forget would have been impossible. Science and myth intersect again in the question of cycles. Some astronomers and geologists suggest that cosmic rhythms, impacts, solar activity, orbital changes, may trigger periodic disruptions on Earth. Plato spoke of a great year cycle, in which fire and water periodically cleansed humanity. Hindu cosmology describes vast yugas ending in destruction and rebirth. The Mayan long count points to cycles of renewal. Could it be that the floods were not random, but part of a rhythm written into the planet and the stars? If so, then our flood myths are not only memories of the past, but warnings for the future. Lull descends when one contemplates the impermanence revealed by ice and sea. Civilisations rise, build, believe themselves secure, but the earth is never still. Ice melts, seas rise, comets fall, tectonics shift. What we call permanence is only pause, what we call history is only fragment. Perhaps this is why myths endure, because they remind us of fragility. They tell us, in voices older than writing, that nothing lasts, that waters always return. The night closes with an image, a plain once green and fertile, now deep beneath the ocean, its rivers forgotten, its villages erased. Above, only waves move, endless and indifferent. The people who once lived there are gone, their names lost, their stories remembered only in fragments of myth. Were they advanced? Were they primitive? The question itself dissolves beneath the waves. What remains is a silence vast as the ocean, and within it the quiet insistence of a truth too large for certainty. We are not the first, and perhaps we will not be the last. There are ruins that do not rest upon land or beneath seas, but within us, in memory, in myth, in the strange persistence of symbols that appear across the world. When the flood erased the tangible, perhaps it left only patterns, fragments of a shared language that traveled farther than stone ever could. To speak of advanced civilizations before ours is not only to seek their cities, but to listen for their voice in the echoes of culture. For if water swept away their monuments, the mind may yet carry what the earth could not. Symbols repeat across continents, as though the same hand drew them in sand and stone oceans apart. The serpent, winding and eternal, appears in Mesoamerica as Quetzalcoatl, in India as Anantashesha, in Norse myth as Jörmungandr, encircling the world. The flood, too, is entwined with the serpent, water rising, coils tightening, cycles beginning again. Did different peoples imagine the same image by chance? Or did they inherit fragments of a story older than their dispersal? Jung spoke of archetypes embedded in the collective unconscious, But one wonders if the unconscious is not shaped, at least in part, by memory, older than we dare admit. At Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, murals painted 9,000 years ago show hunting, ritual, eruption. The people there lived in clustered houses, walking across roofs with no streets between. Their symbols include the bull, the vulture, the goddess-like figure. Thousands of miles away, in South America, similar motifs appear. The same reverence for animals, the same imagery of life, death, and renewal. If these are independent inventions, they reveal a shared human impulse. But if they are not, if they stem from a memory preserved and carried after the flood, then perhaps culture itself is the true ark, bearing fragments of the lost world forward. Conflict rises when skeptics argue that such parallels are coincidence. Human beings everywhere lived with animals, with sky, with water. Of course, they would create similar myths. Yet coincidence falters when precision appears. The Mayan calendar and the ancient Hindu yugas both describe vast cycles of time, epochs of rise and fall spanning thousands of years. Why would such distant cultures conceive of time not as linear but cyclical, unless both carried a memory of collapse and renewal? Why would they describe ages destroyed by water and fire, unless their ancestors had endured both? The possibility that these ideas were not invented, but remembered, unsettles the foundations of how we tell our own story. In Egypt, the Book of the Dead speaks of Zep Tepi, the first time, a golden age when gods walked with humans before catastrophe remade the world. In Greece, Hesiod described earlier races of humanity, gold, silver, bronze, each destroyed before the present Iron Age. In Mesoamerica, myths tell of suns that rose and fell, each age of the world ending in destruction. Always there is a reset, always a memory of before. Could these be cultural reflections of real cycles, marked by floods, preserved in story because nothing else survived? The climax of this mystery emerges when we consider what might truly have been lost. Not machines, not steel, but understanding, ways of mapping the heavens, ways of moving stone, ways of remembering that outlasted the flood itself. We struggle to replicate the precision of megalithic architecture. We puzzle at the astronomical accuracy of ancient alignments. We wonder at myths that describe events we can barely reconstruct through science. Perhaps the greatness of forgotten civilizations was not their technology, but their integration of knowledge, sky, stone, story, into a whole we can no longer see. When the waters came, the integration dissolved, leaving only fragments scattered like shells on a beach. And what of the warnings hidden in these fragments? If floods erased earlier worlds, the survivors may have sought to preserve not only memory, but caution. The myths that speak of arrogance punished, of gods angered, of renewal demanded. Perhaps these are not moral tales alone, but encoded reminders that the earth is not stable, that destruction is inevitable, that survival depends on humility. Civilizations that forget this truth may build high, but the waters wait. Lull returns when one realizes that myths endure not because they are fanciful, but because they resonate. They are remembered when cities are forgotten, whispered when writing is lost. In them, memory drifts like a boat across the floodwaters of time. We cannot know if they record the precise details of drowned cities, but we can know that they carry something vital, an insistence that humanity is older, more fragile, more cyclical than we wish to believe. And so the night closes with an image, not of stone, not of ruin, but of story itself, floating like driftwood on the surface of the flood. We gather around fires, we speak to children, we tell of floods and serpents and ages past. Perhaps we do so because somewhere deep within us lies the faintest recollection of what was erased. Perhaps the myths themselves are ruins, fragments of an ark that carried the memory of a world we cannot see, but still, somehow, feel. There comes a moment in every meditation on the past when silence feels heavier than evidence, when the absence itself becomes its own kind of presence. If the Great Flood erased civilizations before ours, then what we inherit are not ruins alone, but shadows, questions that linger at the edge of imagination. In the final turn of this long journey, one feels less the need to prove than to listen. To myths, to stones, to the quiet pulse of the earth itself. Perhaps the greatest secret is not hidden beneath oceans or glaciers, but within our refusal to see how fragile memory truly is. The flood myths do not end with one culture, one continent. In the Pacific, Polynesian traditions describe waves that swallowed islands, leaving only peaks above the surface. In Micronesia, stories tell of ancestral lands beneath the sea, of voyagers carrying fragments of culture across endless waters after their homes were gone. These are not vague metaphors, but maps disguised as myth, carrying coordinates of loss. To sail among the islands today is to sail above what was once land, to look upon waters that conceal as much as they reveal. The ocean here is both highway and grave, both archive and eraser. In the Arctic, the Inuit speak of great shifts in ice and sea, of times when the land itself seemed to melt. In South America, Amazonian tribes recall floods that remade the forests, their ancestors fleeing to highlands and caves. Even in remote mountain valleys of Tibet, oral traditions speak of waters that once covered the earth, leaving behind only those who clung to peaks. How many voices must echo the same story before the repetition itself becomes a kind of evidence? Yet conflict lingers, sharpened by skepticism. Scholars insist that floods are universal human experiences. Rivers overflow, coasts erode, storms bring destruction. So myths arise naturally. But what if the scale of those ancient floods was beyond local experience? What if the myths remember not seasonal inundations, but world-altering cataclysms? To dismiss them entirely is to mistake silence for absence. Absence is only what we have not yet found, not proof that nothing was there. Climax emerges when we imagine, fully, the scope of what might have been lost. Entire languages vanished without inscription. Sciences built not upon iron and electricity, but upon rhythms of the earth and sky, forgotten when the carriers of that knowledge drowned. Architecture that may have rivaled or surpassed our own, reduced to fragments beneath waves. Civilizations that did not march linearly toward progress, but spiraled, rising and falling with cycles of climate, of comet, of tide. If this is true, then we are not the first chapter of humanity, nor will we be the last. We are but one iteration in a story written and rewritten by water. Perhaps the most haunting possibility is that what we call gods were the survivors of the flood. Figures like Viracocha, Quetzalcoatl, Oannes, Osiris, teachers who arrived from afar, carrying knowledge of agriculture, astronomy, law. To later generations, their wisdom seemed divine, their memory immortal. But what if they were not gods, but men and women who had lived through the end of a world, carrying fragments of knowledge from drowned homelands? The myths that enshrine them would then be memorials, attempts to preserve their presence even as the flood erased the rest. The lull arrives when we confront the humility this vision demands. If civilizations before us were undone by forces beyond their control, then our own is not exempt. Seas rise again, storms grow fiercer, climates shift. We build towers and networks, we map the stars, we dream of permanence. But the earth breathes in cycles, and cycles do not pause for pride. What happened before can happen again. Perhaps the true message of the flood myths is not about punishment or morality, but about impermanence, an eternal reminder that nothing made by hands, no matter how great, is immune to time. And so the night closes with an image that is not ruin, but reflection. The sea at dusk, horizon stretching endless, waves whispering against unseen coasts far below. Beneath those waters lie stories we will never fully read, civilizations erased, yet not entirely gone, for their memory lingers in our myths, their warnings written into our dreams. The flood has taken their names, their faces, their monuments, but not their echoes. We walk upon the shore of that silence, knowing that one day it may rise again to claim us, as it has before. The question remains, suspended like the stars above the sea. Are we the beginning, or merely another cycle, another echo, waiting for the tide to turn? The answer is withheld, left in the hands of time. And perhaps that is as it must be, for the mystery itself is the gift, the reminder that history is not ours to command, but only to glimpse briefly before the waters close once more.